The most brilliant engineers in Silicon Valley couldn't crack the code that was about to destroy a billion-dollar company until a woman in yellow cleaning gloves walked into the room and changed everything in 30 seconds. What happened next will redefine how you see genius forever. Stay with me until the end of this incredible story and drop a comment letting me know what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel around the world. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead like angry wasps as Ethan Cross stared at the wall of monitors displaying nothing but failure. Red error messages cascaded down the screens like digital blood, each one a reminder that his company was hemorrhaging money by the minute. 3 weeks. 3 weeks of sleepless nights, cold coffee, and the kind of desperation that made grown men question everything they thought they knew about themselves. "Sir, we've run the diagnostics 17 times, came the weary voice of Marcus Chen, his lead systems engineer. The man's usually pristine appearance had deteriorated into wrinkled shirts and 5 o'clock shadow that had stretched into a week-long stubble. The autonomous navigation system keeps crashing at the same point. We're looking at a complete failure of the core algorithm." Ethan's reflection stared back at him from the darkened conference room window, a 34-year-old CEO who looked like he'd aged a decade in 3 weeks. His dark hair, usually perfectly styled for board meetings and investor calls, now hung disheveled over tired eyes that had seen too many failed attempts. The irony wasn't lost on him that while he'd built Titan Motors into one of the most promising autonomous vehicle companies in the valley, he couldn't solve the one problem that mattered most. "What about the memory allocation issue Rodriguez identified yesterday?" Ethan asked, though he already knew the answer from the defeated expression on Marcus's face. "Dead end. We reallocated the entire buffer system, optimized the garbage collection, even rewrote the threading protocols from scratch." Marcus rubbed his temples, a gesture that had become as routine as breathing over the past few weeks. "It's like the code has a mind of its own, and it's determined to fail." The conference room door opened with a soft whisper, and Dr. Sarah Kim entered, her usually confident stride replaced by the hesitant steps of someone bearing bad news. As Titan Motors' chief technology officer, Sarah had been Ethan's anchor through every technical storm the company had weathered. Seeing her this defeated sent a chill through his chest. "The board meeting is in 2 hours, she said quietly, setting down a stack of papers that might as well have been Ethan's death warrant. "Jenkins is calling for your resignation. Says the investors are losing confidence in your leadership." Ethan laughed, but there was no humor in it, just the bitter sound of a man watching his life's work crumble. "My leadership, as if I'm the one writing the code that refuses to work." "You know it's not about the technical details," Sarah replied, her voice gentle but firm. "It's about results, and right now we don't have any." The weight of responsibility settled on Ethan's shoulders like a lead blanket. This wasn't just about his career or his ego, though both were certainly on the line. This was about the 47 employees who'd followed his vision, the families depending on those paychecks, and the promise he'd made to revolutionize transportation. More personally, it was about providing for Emma, his 6-year-old daughter, who'd already lost one parent and couldn't afford to lose the stability her father's success provided. "Show me the crash logs again," Ethan said, moving toward the main workstation, where 15 of the industry's brightest minds had spent countless hours chasing ghosts in the machine. The room filled with the soft clicking of keyboards as the team pulled up the familiar displays. Lines of code scrolled past, like hieroglyphics to most people, but to these engineers, each symbol represented hours of carefully crafted logic, designed to help vehicles navigate the world without human intervention. The problem was somewhere in these millions of lines, a needle in a haystack that could bankrupt the company if not found soon. "Here's where it fails every time," said Janet Rodriguez, pointing to a section of code highlighted in angry red. A brilliant programmer in her own right, Janet had joined Titan Motors straight from MIT, with the kind of enthusiasm that made Ethan believe they could change the world. Now she looked as defeated as the rest of them. The vehicle detects an obstacle, begins the avoidance protocol, and then nothing. Complete system freeze. We've traced every function call, analyzed every variable, checked every dependency, added David Park, another member of the core team. It's like the car just decides to give up. Ethan stared at the code, willing himself to see something the others had missed. But the truth was, while he understood business strategy and market dynamics better than anyone in the room, the intricate details of programming were beyond his expertise. He'd hired these brilliant minds precisely because he knew his limitations. Now those limitations felt like a prison. "What if we simplified the algorithm?" suggested Lisa Wang, the newest member of the team. "Strip it down to basic obstacle detection and rebuild from there." "We tried that on day 4, Marcus replied with the patience of someone who'd heard every possible suggestion. "The simplified version works fine until you add real-world complexity. The moment we account for multiple moving objects, weather conditions, or unexpected road configurations, we're back to square one." The silence that followed was deafening. 15 brilliant minds combined decades of experience, state-of-the-art equipment, and unlimited coffee, and they were no closer to a solution than when they'd started. Outside the conference room windows, the sun was setting over Silicon Valley, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that might have been beautiful under different circumstances. Instead, it felt like watching time slip away. Ethan's phone buzzed with a text message from Clara, his nanny running a few minutes late. "Emma's soccer practice went long. We'll have her to you by 7. The reminder of normal life, soccer practices, dinner routines, bedtime stories, felt surreal against the backdrop of corporate crisis. While his company faced extinction, his daughter was out on a field, chasing a ball, and laughing with friends, blissfully unaware that her father's world was collapsing. "Sir?" Marcus's voice cut through his thoughts. "Should we continue working through the night? I know the team is exhausted, but..." "No," Ethan said, surprising himself with the firmness in his voice. "Everyone go home. Get some sleep. We'll tackle this fresh in the morning." "But the board meeting," Sarah started. "The board meeting will happen whether we're running on fumes or not. At this point, a few more hours of spinning our wheels won't make a difference." Ethan looked around the room at the faces of people who'd believed in his vision enough to sacrifice their evenings, weekends, and sanity. "You've all given everything you have. More than anyone could reasonably ask." One by one, the team began packing up their laptops and gathering their personal items. The ritual felt funereal, like they were preparing for the death of something precious. As they filed out of the conference room, exchanging tired goodnights and promises to think about the problem. Overnight, Ethan remained behind, staring at the screens that mocked him with their persistent error messages. The building grew quiet around him, the kind of silence that only exists in office spaces after hours. Somewhere in the distance, a security guard made his rounds, his footsteps echoing through empty hallways. The cleaning crew would arrive soon, moving through the building like ghosts, erasing the evidence of another day's struggles before starting fresh tomorrow. Ethan pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number for Tom Bradley, his lawyer and longtime friend. It rang 3 times before Tom's familiar voice answered. "Ethan, kind of late for a social call." "It's not social, Tom. I need to know my options if the board votes me out tomorrow." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "That bad? Worse. The autonomous system is completely broken, and we can't figure out why. 3 weeks of around-the-clock work, and we're no closer to a solution. The investors are spooked, the board is restless, and I'm starting to think maybe they're right to lose confidence. Hey! Tom's voice carried the authority of someone who'd known Ethan since college. Don't talk like that. You've built something incredible with Titan Motors. One technical setback doesn't erase everything you've accomplished. This isn't just a setback, Tom. This is the core of our entire business model. Without reliable autonomous navigation, we're just another car company with fancy marketing materials. The conversation continued for another 10 minutes, touching on severance packages, non-compete clauses, and the legal intricacies of corporate governance. But even Tom's reassurances couldn't shake the feeling that Ethan was watching his life's work slip through his fingers like sand. After hanging up, Ethan walked to the window and looked out at the parking lot below. A few cars remained the vehicles of other workaholics pulling late nights, or maybe just people who had nowhere else to go. His own car, a prototype of Titan Motors' latest model, sat under a lamppost like a monument to failure. Ironic that he'd driven to work in a vehicle that couldn't even navigate a parking lot without human intervention. The sound of voices in the hallway drew his attention. Someone was approaching multiple people from the sound of it. Ethan glanced at his watch, 7:15 p.m. Too late for scheduled meetings, too early for the cleaning crew. He moved toward the conference room door, curious about who else might be burning the midnight oil. Daddy? The voice was unmistakable, and despite everything that had gone wrong today, Ethan felt his heart lift at the sound of his daughter's excitement. The conference room door burst open, and Emma Cross bounded in with the unstoppable energy that only 6-year-olds possess. Her blonde hair was still pulled back in the ponytail Clara had put in that morning, though several strands had escaped during soccer practice. Her cheeks were flushed with excitement, and she carried a small trophy in her hands. "Look what I won," she announced, holding up the plastic golden figure mounted on a marble base. "Most Improved Player of the Month." "That's incredible, sweetheart," Ethan said, kneeling down to examine the trophy with the appropriate level of awe. "Tell me everything about practice." As Emma launched into an animated recap of her soccer achievements, Ethan became aware of another presence in the room. Clara Hayes stood quietly near the doorway, still wearing the yellow cleaning gloves she'd been using for household chores when she'd picked Emma up from practice. At 28, Clara had the kind of understated beauty that came from someone who didn't spend much time thinking about her appearance. Her brown hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore jeans and a comfortable sweater that had seen better days. "I'm sorry we're so late," Clara said, her voice carrying the slight accent that hinted at her Eastern European background. Practice ran over, and then Emma wanted to stop for ice cream to celebrate her trophy. "No need to apologize," Ethan replied, still marveling at his daughter's trophy. "This is definitely cause for celebration." Clara's eyes had wandered to the bank of monitors still displaying the failed code. Even from across the room, the red error messages were clearly visible. She seemed to study them with more interest than most people would show for incomprehensible technical displays. "Are you working on something difficult?" she asked, her voice carrying genuine curiosity rather than polite small talk. Ethan followed her gaze to the screens. "You could say that. We're trying to solve a problem that's been stumping our entire engineering team for 3 weeks." "What kind of problem?" "The autonomous navigation system for our vehicles keeps crashing. We can't figure out why." Ethan found himself grateful for the distraction of explaining technical challenges to someone outside the industry. Sometimes talking through problems with fresh ears helped clarify thinking. Clara took a few steps closer to the monitors, her cleaning gloves making a soft, rubbery sound as she clasped her hands behind her back. "May I ask what happens when it crashes?" "The vehicle detects an obstacle, begins the avoidance protocol, and then the entire system freezes. Complete failure." Ethan gestured toward the screens with the weary motion of someone who'd explained the same problem countless times. Emma had moved to one of the rolling chairs and was spinning herself in circles, her trophy clutched in her lap. The sight of his daughter's joy provided a stark contrast to the technical despair surrounding them. "Have you checked the memory allocation during the obstacle detection sequence?" Clara asked, her voice so quiet that Ethan almost missed the question. He turned to look at her more carefully. "I'm sorry." "The memory allocation. When the system detects an obstacle, it needs to create temporary objects to model the avoidance paths. If there's a conflict in how that memory is allocated and deallocated, it could cause the kind of freeze you're describing." Ethan stared at her, feeling like he'd just heard his nanny speak fluent Mandarin. "How do you know about memory allocation?" Clara's cheeks flushed slightly, and she looked down at her hands. I used to work with computers. Before Emma. Before I became her nanny. I had a different career." There was something in her tone that suggested this wasn't a casual hobby or a college course she'd taken years ago. This was the voice of someone who understood the technical details at a level that most people never reached. "What kind of work with computers?" Ethan pressed gently. Clara was quiet for a moment, watching Emma spin in the chair. "Programming, systems architecture, that sort of thing." "Where?" Another pause. "Different places, mostly government contracts." The vagueness of her answers only heightened Ethan's curiosity, but before he could ask more questions, Emma stopped spinning and announced that she was dizzy. The moment of technical discussion was broken, as both adults rushed to make sure she was okay. "I should get her home," Clara said, helping Emma out of the chair. "It's past her bedtime and she has school tomorrow." "Of course," Ethan agreed, though part of him wanted to continue their conversation about memory allocation and systems architecture. "Thank you for bringing her by. And congratulations again on the trophy, Emma." As they prepared to leave, Clara glanced once more at the monitors. "If you'd like, I could take a look at the code sometime. I might be able to spot something your team missed." The offer was made casually, almost as an afterthought, but something in her tone suggested she was serious. Ethan found himself considering the idea, despite how absurd it seemed on the surface. His nanny offering to solve a problem that had defeated 15 professional engineers. "I appreciate the offer," he said diplomatically. "Though I should warn you, we've had some very talented people working on this." "I'm sure you have," Clara replied with a small smile. "Sometimes fresh eyes help." After they left, Ethan remained in the conference room, staring at the monitors and thinking about Clara's unexpected knowledge of technical systems. He'd hired her 6 months ago through a reputable agency, and her references had been impeccable. She was wonderful, with Emma responsible, trustworthy, and had quickly become an indispensable part of their household routine. But he'd never thought to ask about her background beyond her childcare experience. The idea that his nanny might be able to solve his company's most critical problem was almost laughable. Yet something about the way she'd looked at the code, the specific questions she'd asked, suggested she knew more than she was letting on. Ethan pulled out his phone and called Marcus, who answered on the second ring despite the late hour. "Did we miss something?" Ethan asked without preamble. "Miss something where? Memory allocation during obstacle detection. Could there be a conflict in how temporary objects are created and destroyed?" There was a pause as Marcus considered the question. "We looked at memory management early on, but we might not have focused specifically on the obstacle detection sequence." "Why do you ask?" "Just a thought. Can you have the team check it first thing tomorrow?" "Sure, but Ethan, where did this idea come from?" Ethan looked out the window at the empty parking lot below. Someone suggested it. I'll explain later. After ending the call, he finally began packing up his own materials for the night. Tomorrow would bring the board meeting difficult conversations and possibly the end of his tenure as CEO. But for the first time in 3 weeks, he had something resembling hope, even if it came from the most unlikely source imaginable. As he turned off the lights and headed for the elevator, Ethan found himself thinking about Clara's offer to look at the code. It was probably nothing, just a well-meaning gesture from someone who'd taken a programming class in college. But in his current situation, he couldn't afford to dismiss any possibility, no matter how remote. The elevator doors closed with a soft ding, carrying him down toward the parking garage, and another sleepless night of wondering if tomorrow would bring salvation or the final confirmation that some problems simply couldn't be solved. The boardroom at Titan Motors had witnessed many tense moments over the years, but the atmosphere on this particular Thursday morning felt different, heavier, more final. Ethan arrived 40 minutes before the scheduled meeting, hoping to use the time to organize his thoughts and prepare for what could be his last stand as CEO. The coffee in his hand had gone cold during the drive to the office, but he drank it anyway, needing the familiar ritual more than the caffeine. The morning sun streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, casting long shadows across the polished conference table where he'd made countless decisions that had shaped the company's destiny. In a few hours, that same table would be surrounded by board members ready to dissect his leadership and possibly vote him out of the position he'd fought so hard to build. His phone buzzed with a text from Marcus. "Running the memory allocation diagnostics now. We'll have results before your meeting." At least one good thing might come from yesterday's conversation with Clara. Even if her suggestion led nowhere, it felt good to have a new avenue to explore rather than rehashing the same failed approaches. The conference room door opened and Sarah entered carrying 2 laptops and wearing the expression of someone who'd been awake most of the night. Her usually immaculate appearance showed signs of strain. Her hair was pulled back in a hasty ponytail, and there were dark circles under her eyes that concealer couldn't quite hide. "Please tell me you have good news," Ethan said, though her expression already provided the answer. "I wish I did." The team worked until 3 a.m. running every diagnostic we could think of. The memory allocation check turned up some interesting anomalies, but nothing that explains the consistent crashes. Sarah set her laptops on the table and powered them up. "Marcus wants to dig deeper into the threading protocols, but we're running out of time. How much time do we have before Jenkins and the others arrive?" 20 minutes, maybe 30 if traffic is bad on 101. Ethan nodded, using the time to review the presentation Sarah had prepared for the board. The slides laid out their technical challenges with brutal honesty, 3 weeks of failed attempts, mounting costs, and no clear path forward. It was the kind of transparency that boards appreciated in theory, but rarely tolerated when it threatened their investments. "Sir," Marcus's voice came from the doorway, and something in his tone made both Ethan and Sarah look up quickly. "We need to talk." The urgency in Marcus's voice sent a spike of adrenaline through Ethan's system. Either they'd discovered something significant, or the problem was even worse than they'd realized. "What did you find?" Marcus moved to the workstation and pulled up a series of diagnostic screens that meant nothing to Ethan, but clearly troubled the engineer. "The memory allocation issue your contact mentioned yesterday, they were right to flag it. We found some serious anomalies in how the system handles temporary objects during obstacle detection." "Anomalies, how?" "The system creates these temporary modeling objects to calculate avoidance paths, right? But there's a conflict in the threading protocol that's causing memory leaks. Not huge ones individually, but they accumulate over time until the system can't allocate enough memory to complete the avoidance calculation." Sarah moved to look over Marcus's shoulder at the diagnostic data. "How did we miss this for 3 weeks?" Because the memory leaks only happen under very specific conditions. The system has to be processing multiple obstacles simultaneously while running certain background processes. In our controlled testing environment, we rarely replicated those exact conditions. Ethan felt a flicker of hope, tempered by caution. Can you fix it? Maybe. The threading conflict is complex, but it's not impossible to resolve. The problem is that we need time to test any changes thoroughly. One mistake could make the system even less stable. How much time? Marcus exchanged a look with Sarah before answering. Done right, 2 weeks minimum, maybe 3. The hope flickered and died. We don't have 2 weeks. We barely have 2 hours. I know. That's why I wanted to talk to you before the board meeting. We could implement a quick fix that might resolve the immediate crashing, but without proper testing, we'd be gambling with the entire system's integrity. The sound of voices in the hallway indicated that board members were beginning to arrive. Ethan could hear Robert Jenkins's distinctive laugh, the kind of forced joviality that preceded difficult conversations. In a few minutes, he'd be facing questions he couldn't answer and defending decisions that had led to this crisis. Do the quick fix, Ethan said, surprising both engineers. Sir, if something goes wrong, Marcus started. If something goes wrong, we're in the same position we're in now. But if it works even temporarily, we buy ourselves time to implement a proper solution. Sarah looked skeptical. It's a huge risk. Everything's a risk at this point. At least this way we're taking action instead of just explaining why we can't solve the problem. Marcus nodded reluctantly and began typing commands into the workstation. I'll need about 15 minutes to implement the changes and run a basic functionality test. You have 10 minutes, Ethan replied, checking his watch as more voices filled the hallway outside. The next 10 minutes passed in tense silence, broken only by the clicking of Marcus's keyboard and the occasional muttered comment as he worked through the code modifications. Sarah used the time to update her presentation slides, removing some of the more dire projections and adding a note about potential breakthrough developments. At exactly 9:00 a.m., the conference room door opened and the board members filed in with the solemnity of a funeral procession. Robert Jenkins led the group, his silver hair perfectly styled, and his expensive suit conveying the authority that came with 40 years of corporate leadership. Behind him came Margaret Sullivan, the venture capitalist, whose firm had provided much of Titan Motors' initial funding, followed by the other members who held Ethan's professional fate in their hands. Good morning, everyone, Ethan said, standing to greet each member with handshakes that felt like diplomatic negotiations. Thank you for making time for this emergency session. Jenkins settled into his chair at the opposite end of the table from Ethan, a positioning that felt deliberately confrontational. Let's dispense with pleasantries, shall we? We're here because Titan Motors is facing a crisis that threatens our entire investment. I think we all deserve to know exactly where things stand. Sarah began the presentation with her characteristic precision, walking through the technical challenges they'd encountered and the various approaches they'd attempted. The board members listened with expressions ranging from concerned to openly skeptical, occasionally asking questions that revealed both their business acumen and their limited understanding of the technical complexities involved. So let me understand this correctly, Margaret Sullivan interrupted, about halfway through the presentation. You've had 15 engineers working around the clock for 3 weeks, and you're no closer to a solution than when you started. That's not entirely accurate, Sarah replied diplomatically. We've eliminated dozens of potential causes and narrowed the problem down to specific areas of the code. This morning we identified what we believe is the root cause. You believe? Jenkins's tone carried the weight of someone who'd heard too many qualified statements from companies seeking more time and money. Ethan decided to take control of the narrative before the questioning became more hostile. We've identified a memory allocation conflict that occurs under very specific conditions. Our team is implementing a fix as we speak. And you're confident this fix will resolve the issue? Asked David Chen, another board member, whose background in manufacturing had made him particularly sensitive to production delays. We're confident we've found the source of the problem. The fix will require thorough testing to ensure system stability, but initial indicators are promising. It wasn't entirely a lie, but it stretched the truth about as far as it could go without breaking. Ethan could see Marcus working frantically at the workstation, his fingers flying across the keyboard as he made real-time modifications to code that controlled million-dollar vehicles. How long until you know whether this fix actually works? Sullivan asked. Before Ethan could answer, Marcus looked up from his screen with an expression that was hard to read. Sir, could I speak with you privately for a moment? The request sent a ripple of unease through the room. Private conferences during board meetings were never good signs, and Ethan could see the skepticism deepening on several faces as he moved toward the workstation. The basic fix is implemented, Marcus said quietly, his voice pitched so only Ethan could hear. But I need to run it through the full simulation before we can be sure it's stable. How long? 20 minutes for a complete test cycle. Ethan glanced back at the board members who were watching the whispered conversation with obvious impatience. 20 minutes of dead time during a crisis meeting would be political suicide. Run the test, he said. I'll handle the board. Returning to his seat, Ethan faced the expectant stares of people who controlled his company's future. We're running the verification test now. Results in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Jenkins's eyebrows rose. And we're supposed to just sit here and wait? You could use the time to discuss other aspects of the company's performance, Ethan suggested. Our sales figures for the quarter have actually exceeded projections by 12%. The next 20 minutes felt like 20 hours, as the board peppered Ethan with questions about everything from market positioning to employee retention rates. He answered as best he could, while keeping one eye on Marcus, who remained hunched over the workstation, running diagnostics and muttering under his breath. Finally, Marcus straightened up and caught Ethan's attention with a subtle nod. The relief that flooded through Ethan's system was almost overwhelming. Ladies and gentlemen, Ethan announced, interrupting a question about supply chain management. I'm pleased to report that our initial test of the system fix has been successful. The room fell silent as all attention focused on Marcus, who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else in the world than explaining technical details to a room full of business executives. The autonomous navigation system completed a full obstacle avoidance sequence without crashing, Marcus reported. All primary functions are operating within normal parameters. One successful test hardly constitutes a solution, Jenkins pointed out, though his tone had lost some of its earlier hostility. Agreed, Ethan replied. We'll need extensive testing before declaring the problem solved, but this represents the first successful modification we've achieved in 3 weeks of effort. Margaret Sullivan leaned forward in her chair. What's your timeline for complete verification? 2 weeks for comprehensive testing, assuming the initial results hold up. And if they don't? Ethan met her gaze directly. Then we go back to the drawing board. But for the first time since this crisis began, we have a clear path forward. The board members exchanged glances, and Ethan could sense the political calculations happening in real time. A potential solution, even an unproven one, changed the dynamics of their decision-making process. I propose we table any leadership discussions for 2 weeks, Sullivan said after a moment. If Titan Motors can demonstrate a working solution to the autonomous navigation problem, we continue as planned. If not, we revisit all options. Jenkins looked like he wanted to object, but the other board members seemed to agree with Sullivan's approach. After another 10 minutes of discussion about milestones and reporting requirements, the meeting adjourned with Ethan still in his position as CEO, though clearly on borrowed time. As the board members filed out of the conference room, as Sarah approached Ethan with a mixture of relief and concern on her face. "That was closer than I'd like," she said once they were alone. "Closer than any of us would like. But we bought ourselves time, and that's what we needed most." Marcus was still at the workstation running additional diagnostics on the modified code. "Sir, the fix is holding stable, but I'm seeing some anomalies in the data patterns that I can't explain." "What kind of anomalies?" "The system is performing better than our models predicted. Reaction times are faster, path calculations are more efficient. It's like the fix didn't just solve the crashing problem, it optimized the entire navigation algorithm." Ethan frowned. "That doesn't make sense. A memory allocation fix shouldn't impact performance metrics." "That's what's puzzling me. I've run the diagnostics 3 times and the results are consistent. Whatever we changed, it's had effects beyond what we intended." The mystery was intriguing, but Ethan's immediate concern was ensuring the fix remained stable long enough to satisfy the board's expectations. "Keep monitoring it. Document everything. And Marcus." "Yes, sir. Good work. I know this has been hell for everyone, but you and the team pulled through when it mattered most." After Marcus returned to his monitoring duties, Ethan found himself thinking about the conversation that had led to this breakthrough. Clara's casual question about memory allocation had pointed them toward the solution that 15 professional engineers had missed for 3 weeks. It seemed impossible that a nanny with some undefined background in programming could spot something that experienced professionals had overlooked. His phone buzzed with a text message from Clara. "Emma forgot her science project at home. I'm bringing it to school now, but wanted to let you know she might be a few minutes late to class." The normalcy of the message, forgotten homework, school schedules, the routine concerns of parenthood, provided a stark contrast to the corporate drama he'd just navigated. It also reminded him that he owed Clara a debt of gratitude for the suggestion that might have saved his career. He typed back, "No problem. Thanks for taking care of it. Any chance you could stop by the office later? I'd like to discuss yesterday's conversation." The response came quickly. "Of course. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine. Actually better than fine. I'll explain when I see you." After sending the message, Ethan spent the rest of the morning working with his team to develop a comprehensive testing protocol for the navigation system. The fix was holding stable, but they needed to verify its performance under every conceivable scenario before declaring victory. Around 2 o'clock, Clara arrived at the office, carrying a small bag and wearing the same understated clothes she'd had on the previous evening. She looked slightly nervous as Ethan's assistant showed her to the conference room, where he was reviewing test data with Sarah and Marcus. "Thank you for coming," Ethan said, standing to greet her. "I wanted to thank you properly for yesterday's suggestion." Clara looked confused. "My suggestion about the memory allocation during obstacle detection. You were right. That's exactly where the problem was." "Oh." Clara's cheeks flushed slightly. "I'm glad it helped." Sarah looked between Ethan and Clara with obvious curiosity. "I'm sorry, but I don't think we've been introduced." "Sarah Kim, this is Clara Hayes. Clara is Emma's nanny and apparently also the person who identified the solution to our navigation problem." Sarah's eyebrows rose. "You're a programmer." "I used to be," Clara replied quietly, clearly uncomfortable with the attention. "Used to be where?" Marcus asked, looking up from his workstation with interest. Clara hesitated, glancing at Ethan, as if asking permission to share information she'd previously kept private. "Different places. Government projects, mostly." What kind of government projects? Sarah pressed gently. The classified kind, Clara answered with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. The admission hung in the air for a moment, adding context to Clara's technical knowledge while raising new questions about her background. Government programming projects could range from mundane database management to cutting-edge artificial intelligence research. Well, whatever your background, Ethan said, your suggestion saved our company. The fix is working perfectly. Actually, Marcus interrupted, that's what I wanted to discuss with you. The fix is working, but it's working too well. Clara's expression sharpened with interest. Too well how? Marcus pulled up the diagnostic displays and walked through the performance improvements they'd observed since implementing the memory allocation fix. As he spoke, Clara moved closer to the monitors, her attention focused entirely on the data streams scrolling across the screens. The reaction time improvements don't make sense, she said, after Marcus finished his explanation. A memory leak fix shouldn't optimize path calculation algorithms. That's exactly what we can't figure out, Sarah replied. It's like the system is performing better than it was designed to perform. Clara studied the displays for several more minutes, occasionally asking Marcus to show her specific data sets or code segments. Watching her work, Ethan began to understand that her knowledge went far beyond casual familiarity with programming concepts. She was reading the diagnostic data with the fluency of someone who'd spent years working with complex systems. May I? Clara asked, gesturing toward the keyboard. Marcus stepped aside and Clara began typing commands with the kind of muscle memory that comes from extensive experience. She pulled up system logs, analyzed memory usage patterns, and traced execution paths through the code with remarkable speed and precision. Here, she said after about 10 minutes of investigation, you didn't just fix the memory allocation problem. You accidentally optimized the threading architecture. She pointed to a section of code that meant nothing to Ethan, but clearly made sense to Marcus and Sarah, who both leaned in to study the details. The original threading protocol was creating unnecessary overhead, Clara continued. When you fixed the memory leak, you also eliminated redundant thread creation during the obstacle detection sequence. That's why the system is running more efficiently. But how did we miss that relationship during development? Sarah asked. Because you were looking at the components individually instead of analyzing their interactions under stress conditions. It's a common oversight in complex systems architecture. The casual way Clara discussed complex systems architecture made it clear that her background was far more sophisticated than she'd initially let on. Ethan found himself wondering what kind of government projects required that level of expertise. Clara, he said carefully, I have to ask, what exactly did you do before you became Emma's nanny? She was quiet for a long moment, her hands resting on the keyboard as she considered how much to reveal. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of someone sharing information she'd kept carefully guarded. I was the lead systems architect for something called the Orion Project. The name meant nothing to Ethan, but he saw recognition flash across Marcus's face. The Orion Project. The Autonomous Systems Research Initiative that was shut down 2 years ago. Clara nodded. That's the one. I read about that project in graduate school, Marcus said, his voice filled with a mixture of awe and curiosity. The technical papers that came out of it were revolutionary. The work on predictive navigation algorithms alone advanced the field by decades. Until it all fell apart, Clara said quietly. Sarah leaned forward. What happened? Political pressures, budget cuts, internal conflicts between different agencies who wanted control of the technology. Clara's expression grew distant, as if she was remembering events she'd rather forget. The project was classified, so when it ended, most of the team couldn't even discuss their work publicly. Career suicide in an industry that values publications and patents. "So you became a nanny?" Ethan asked, though he immediately regretted the way the question sounded. "I needed a job that didn't require background checks or extensive references from previous employers. Childcare agencies care more about whether you're good with kids than whether you've published papers in technical journals." Clara's smile returned, but it was tinged with sadness. "And I discovered I actually love working with children. Emma is wonderful." The pieces were beginning to fit together for Ethan. A brilliant systems architect whose career had been derailed by circumstances beyond her control, forced to start over in a completely different field. It explained her technical knowledge, her reluctance to discuss her background, and her genuine affection for Emma. "The Orion Project," Marcus said clearly, still processing the revelation. "That was next-generation artificial intelligence applied to autonomous systems. Some of the most advanced work ever done in the field. Which is why I recognize the patterns in your navigation problem," Clara replied. "We dealt with similar threading and memory management issues during Orion development. The solutions weren't always obvious, but the underlying principles were consistent." Ethan felt a mixture of gratitude and guilt as he realized the magnitude of what Clara had done. Not only had she solved their immediate crisis, but she'd done so while hiding her own professional expertise and the personal cost of her career change. "Clara," he said, "I need to ask you something, and I want you to know you can say no without any impact on your position with Emma." She looked at him cautiously. "What kind of something, Quo? Would you consider consulting on our autonomous systems development, not full-time? I know your priority is Emma, but maybe a few hours a week to review our technical approaches and help us avoid the kind of problems we just encountered." The offer hung in the air as Clara considered its implications. Taking on technical consulting work would mean acknowledging her professional background, stepping back into a field that had treated her badly, and potentially dealing with recognition from others who might remember the Orion Project. "I don't know," she said finally. "I've been out of the field for 2 years. Technology moves quickly." "Not that quickly," Marcus interjected. "The fundamental principles of systems architecture don't change overnight. And your insights into our current problem prove you haven't lost your edge." Sarah nodded in agreement. "We could really use someone with your background. Our team is talented, but we don't have anyone with experience in large-scale autonomous systems integration." Clara looked at Ethan, clearly weighing her options. "What about Emma?" "My first responsibility is to her. And it would remain so," Ethan assured her. "This would be flexible consulting work that fits around her schedule. A few hours here and there when you have time and when we need your input on specific problems. I'd need to think about it." "Of course. Take all the time you need." As the afternoon wore on, Clara spent more time reviewing their systems architecture and suggesting optimizations that could improve performance and reliability. Her insights were both practical and innovative, combining theoretical knowledge with real-world experience in ways that impressed everyone on the team. By evening, the navigation system had completed 12 hours of continuous testing without a single failure. The memory allocation fix was holding stable, and the performance improvements Clara had identified were consistent across all test scenarios. "I should get home," Clara said, as the sun began setting over Silicon Valley. "Emma will be wondering where I am." "Of course," Ethan replied. "And Clara, thank you for everything. I know this isn't what you signed up for when you agreed to be Emma's nanny. Sometimes the most important solutions come from unexpected places," she said, with a smile that seemed more genuine than any she'd offered earlier in the day. After she left, Ethan remained in the conference room with Sarah and Marcus, reviewing the day's developments and planning their next steps. The immediate crisis had passed, but the experience had revealed both the fragility of their technical systems and the unexpected resources available to address future challenges. "She's remarkable," Sarah said, as they watched Clara's car pull out of the parking lot. "I've never seen anyone diagnose complex systems problems that quickly." "Makes you wonder what other talent is hiding in plain sight," Marcus added. "How many brilliant people are working jobs that don't utilize their real capabilities?" Ethan nodded, thinking about the broader implications of Clara's situation. How many other careers had been derailed by circumstances beyond individual control? How many potentially revolutionary innovations were lost because talented people couldn't find appropriate outlets for their expertise? The questions would have to wait for another day. For now, it was enough that Titan Motors had survived its crisis, and that Emma's nanny had proven to be far more than anyone had imagined. The following week passed in a blur of successful test runs and growing confidence, but Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that they were living on borrowed time. Each morning brought new diagnostic reports confirming that Clara's fix continued to hold stable, yet the memory of how close they'd come to complete failure haunted his thoughts. More troubling was the realization that their salvation had come from someone whose talents they'd never recognized, whose expertise had been hiding behind the mundane routine of school pickups and bedtime stories. Clara had agreed to think about the consulting position, but she hadn't given him an answer yet. In the meantime, she continued her regular duties with Emma, while occasionally stopping by the office to review technical documentation or offer insights on system optimization. Her presence had become a source of quiet reassurance for the entire engineering team, who had begun seeking her input on problems that went far beyond the original navigation crisis. It was during one of these informal consultations that everything changed. Marcus had been struggling with an intermittent sensor calibration issue that caused minor but persistent errors in the vehicle's environmental mapping system. The errors weren't dangerous, the backup systems caught them every time, but they represented the kind of imperfection that could delay regulatory approval and undermine consumer confidence. "The sensors are reading environmental data correctly," Marcus explained to Clara as she studied the diagnostic output on his monitor. "But there's a slight delay in how that data gets processed by the navigation algorithms. It's like there's a bottleneck somewhere in the data pipeline." Clara leaned closer to the screen, her brow furrowed in concentration. Emma sat nearby in a rolling chair working on homework while occasionally spinning herself in slow circles. The casual domesticity of the scene, a child doing arithmetic problems while her nanny debugged autonomous vehicle software, had become so normal that no one in the office found it strange anymore. "Show me the sensor array configuration," Clara said, her fingers already moving toward the keyboard. As Marcus pulled up the technical specifications, Clara began typing commands with the fluid precision that still amazed everyone who watched her work. She navigated through system menus and diagnostic tools like someone returning to a familiar neighborhood after a long absence. "Here's your problem," she said after several minutes of investigation. "The sensor calibration protocols are running on the same processing thread as the primary navigation calculations. During high-complexity scenarios, the navigation system takes priority and the calibration routines get delayed. Can we fix it without disrupting the main navigation algorithms?" Marcus asked. "Easily. You just need to isolate the calibration routines on dedicated processing threads. I can show you how to." Clara stopped mid-sentence, her expression suddenly changing from concentrated focus to something approaching alarm. She was staring at a section of code that had appeared on the screen, but her reaction seemed disproportionate to whatever technical detail had caught her attention. "What is it?" Marcus asked, noticing her sudden stillness. "This code architecture," Clara said slowly, her voice carrying a tension that hadn't been there moments before. Where did it come from? That's part of our core navigation framework. We licensed it from Advanced Dynamics Corporation about 18 months ago. Why? Clara didn't answer immediately. She scrolled through several more sections of code, her expression growing more troubled with each screen. Finally, she pushed back from the workstation and turned to face Marcus with obvious concern. You need to get Ethan down here right now. The urgency in her voice was unmistakable, and Marcus didn't hesitate before picking up his phone to call Ethan's office. Within minutes, Ethan arrived in the engineering bay, followed closely by Sarah, who had been in a meeting with the marketing team when Marcus's call interrupted. What's wrong? Ethan asked immediately, picking up on the tension that had settled over the room. Clara gestured toward the monitor displaying the navigation code. This software architecture you licensed from Advanced Dynamics, where exactly did they say it came from? Ethan looked to Sarah, who handled most of the company's technology licensing agreements. Standard commercial licensing, Sarah replied. They developed it for military applications and adapted it for civilian autonomous vehicles. We paid a substantial fee for exclusive rights in our market segment. They didn't develop this, Clara said flatly. This is Orion Project code. The words landed like a physical blow, creating a moment of stunned silence in the room. Even Emma looked up from her homework, sensing that something important was happening, even if she didn't understand the technical details. That's impossible, Sarah said. Advanced Dynamics provided complete documentation of their development process, independent verification of intellectual property ownership. Then either they lied or someone at Advanced Dynamics had access to classified government research. Clara's voice carried the weight of someone who understood the implications of what she was saying. This isn't similar code or inspired by code. This is literally the same code base I helped develop for the Orion project. Ethan felt the familiar sensation of crisis settling over him, but this time the threat came from an entirely different direction. What does that mean for us legally? It means Titan Motors is potentially using stolen government intellectual property, Clara replied. And depending on how Advanced Dynamics obtained this code, you could be looking at everything from civil lawsuits to federal criminal charges. The engineering bay fell silent except for the humming of computer fans and the distant sound of traffic outside. Ethan's mind raced through the implications of Clara's revelation. After surviving the technical crisis that had nearly destroyed the company, they now faced a legal and ethical disaster that could be even more devastating. How certain are you? Sarah asked, her voice carefully controlled. Clara turned back to the monitor and began pulling up specific sections of code. See this function here? This is the core pathfinding algorithm I wrote personally, and this subroutine for handling sensor data conflicts. That's mine too. The variable naming conventions, the comment structure, even the debugging statements, everything matches exactly. She continued scrolling through the code, pointing out details that meant nothing to Ethan, but clearly resonated with Marcus and Sarah, who had become increasingly pale as Clara's explanation continued. There are over 2,000 lines of code here that I can identify as coming directly from the Orion project, Clara concluded. This isn't coincidence or parallel development. Someone took classified government software and repackaged it as a commercial product. Ethan sank into a nearby chair, feeling the weight of yet another crisis threatening his company's survival. What's our legal exposure? Potentially catastrophic, Sarah replied after a moment of consideration. If the government decides to pursue this, they could claim that every vehicle we've built using this software violates federal law. Seizure of assets, criminal charges for the executives, complete shutdown of operations. But we didn't know, Marcus protested. "We licensed the software in good faith from what we thought was a legitimate vendor." "That might provide some protection," Clara said, though her tone wasn't particularly reassuring. "But it doesn't eliminate the problem. The government doesn't like it when their classified research ends up in commercial products regardless of how it got there." Emma had stopped working on her homework and was watching the adult conversation with the wide-eyed attention that children bring to moments when they sense their world might be changing. Ethan caught her eye and managed a reassuring smile, though he wasn't feeling particularly reassured himself. "What do we do?" he asked Clara. "First, you need to stop using the compromised code immediately. Every day you continue operating with stolen intellectual property makes your legal position worse. That would mean shutting down our entire autonomous navigation system," Sarah pointed out. "We'd have to recall every vehicle, suspend all testing, basically halt operations while we develop replacement software." "How long would that take?" Ethan asked. Marcus looked sick. "Starting from scratch, 8 months minimum, maybe a year. And that's assuming we can even match the performance levels of the current system." The implications were staggering. Titan Motors would have to admit to its customers, investors, and regulators that their entire product line was based on potentially stolen technology. The company would face massive financial losses, legal liability, and the destruction of its reputation in the marketplace. "There might be another option," Clara said quietly. Everyone turned to look at her, desperate for any alternative to complete disaster. "I still have my security clearance from the Orion project. It's been inactive for 2 years, but it hasn't been revoked. If I could get it reactivated, I might be able to work with the government to find a solution that doesn't destroy your company." "What kind of solution?" Ethan asked. "Proper licensing of the Orion technology. If the government agrees to license the software legitimately, you could continue using it while paying appropriate fees and royalties. It would be expensive, but it would be legal." Sarah looked skeptical. "Would they agree to that license classified military technology to a private company?" The Orion project was always intended to have civilian applications eventually. The military benefits were just the initial focus. And given that the technology is already being used commercially, the government might prefer legitimate licensing over lengthy legal battles. It was a slim hope, but it was better than the alternatives Ethan could see. "What would you need to make this happen?" "Access to my former contacts in the Defense Department. Permission to discuss the technical details of the Orion project, which would require reactivating my clearance, and time to negotiate a deal that works for everyone involved." "How much time?" "Weeks, not months. But there's no guarantee it would work. Government bureaucracy moves slowly, and there are political considerations I can't predict." Ethan looked around the room at his team, all of whom were watching him, with expressions that mixed hope and fear in equal measure. The decision he made in the next few minutes could determine whether Titan Motors survived or joined the long list of promising companies that had been destroyed by circumstances beyond their control. "Do it," he said finally. "Whatever you need, whatever resources you require, you have my full support." Clara nodded, but her expression remained serious. "There's something else you need to understand. If I do this, if I reactivate my clearance and start working with the government again, I won't be able to continue as Emma's nanny." The words hit Ethan like a physical blow. In all his considerations of the legal and financial implications, he hadn't thought about the personal cost of Clara's involvement. Emma would lose the caregiver who had become such an important part of her life, and Ethan would lose someone who had become far more than an employee. "Why not?" he asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "Conflict of interest regulations. I can't simultaneously work for a private company and maintain an active security clearance that gives me access to classified information." The government doesn't allow that kind of dual loyalty. Emma had been listening to the conversation with increasing concern, and now she looked up from her homework with obvious worry. "Are you going away, Clara?" Clara knelt down next to Emma's chair, her professional composure softening into something more personal. "I might have to, sweetheart, but only to help your daddy's company with a very important problem." "But you'll come back, right?" The question hung in the air, and Ethan could see Clara struggling with how to answer honestly without frightening a 6-year-old. The truth was that none of them knew what would happen if Clara's plan succeeded. Would she return to government work permanently? Would she be able to continue any relationship with the Cross family? Would the solution to Titan Motors' crisis come at the cost of the stability Emma had found with Clara's presence in their life? "I don't know yet," Clara answered finally. "But I promise that whatever happens, it won't change how much I care about you." Emma nodded with the serious acceptance that children sometimes show when faced with adult problems they can't control. Then she returned to her homework, though Ethan could see that her concentration had been broken by the uncertainty now surrounding her routine. "I need to make some phone calls," Clara said, standing and moving toward the door. Reactivating a security clearance isn't something that happens quickly, and we'll need to move fast if we're going to get ahead of this problem. After she left, Ethan remained in the engineering bay with Sarah and Marcus, all of them trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just learned. In the span of 30 minutes, their celebration of technical success had transformed into a new crisis that threatened everything they'd built. "How did we miss this during our due diligence?" Sarah asked, her voice carrying the frustration of someone who prided herself on thorough preparation. "Because we had no reason to suspect that a major defense contractor was selling stolen government property," Ethan replied. "Advanced Dynamics has been in business for 20 years. They have contracts with the Pentagon, NASA, major corporations. They looked completely legitimate." "They probably are legitimate," Marcus added. "It's possible someone within their organization had access to Orion project materials and used them without authorization. Corporate espionage, rogue employees, compromised security. There are dozens of ways classified information can leak into commercial channels." The speculation was interesting, but ultimately irrelevant to their immediate situation. Regardless of how Advanced Dynamics had obtained the Orion code, Titan Motors was now in possession of stolen intellectual property and faced the potential consequences of that situation. "What's our backup plan if Clara's approach doesn't work?" Ethan asked. Sarah pulled up financial projections on her laptop, though the numbers she showed him weren't encouraging. "Complete suspension of operations while we develop replacement software would cost us approximately $8 million per month in fixed costs alone. We'd have to lay off most of the engineering team, halt all production, and essentially start over with a new technical foundation." "How long could we survive financially?" 4 months, maybe 5 if we cut expenses to the bone. After that, we'd be looking at bankruptcy or fire sale acquisition, us, by a larger company. The timeline was brutally short, but it was better than Ethan had feared. If Clara could negotiate a government licensing deal within a few months, Titan Motors might survive with its independence intact. If not, they'd join the countless other startups that had been crushed by forces beyond their control. "There's one more thing we need to consider," Marcus said, his voice carrying reluctance to raise another complication. "If news of this gets out before we resolve it, our stock price will collapse, and our customers will abandon us. We need to keep this completely confidential until we have a solution." Ethan nodded, understanding the additional pressure that secrecy would place on everyone involved. They couldn't seek outside legal counsel without risking leaks, couldn't explain operational changes to employees without revealing the underlying crisis, couldn't even discuss the situation with board members until they had a clear path forward. "How many people know about this right now?" he asked. "Just the four of us and Clara," Sarah replied. "But we'll need to bring in legal counsel eventually, and probably some of the senior technical staff. Keep the circle as small as possible for now. If Clara's plan works, we might be able to resolve this without anyone else even knowing there was a problem." The next several hours passed in tense preparation as they began documenting the extent of the compromised code and developing contingency plans for different scenarios. Clara returned to the office around 6 o'clock, carrying a folder of official-looking documents and wearing an expression that was hard to read. "I've spoken with my former supervisor at the Defense Department," she announced. "The good news is that they're willing to discuss legitimate licensing of Orion technology. The bad news is that the process will require extensive review and approval from multiple agencies." "How extensive?" Ethan asked. 6 to 8 weeks minimum, assuming no major complications. They'll need to evaluate Titan Motors' security protocols, conduct background checks on key personnel, and assess the national security implications of civilian deployment. And in the meantime, you can continue operating under temporary authorization provided you agree to certain restrictions and oversight requirements. The relief that flooded through Ethan was almost overwhelming. Temporary authorization meant they wouldn't have to shut down operations while negotiations continued. They could maintain their customer commitments, keep their employees working, and preserve the company's market position. "What kind of restrictions?" Sarah asked. Clara consulted her notes. "Enhanced security protocols for all technical data. Regular audits of your software development processes. Restrictions on international sales until permanent licensing is approved. And you'll need to designate a security liaison who can interface with government oversight personnel." "I'm guessing that would be you," Ethan said. "If you're willing to accept the arrangement. I'd be working half-time for Titan Motors and half-time for the government, ensuring compliance with security requirements while helping negotiate the permanent licensing agreement." It was exactly the kind of arrangement that Ethan had hoped for, but it still came with the personal cost he'd been dreading. "And Emma?" Clara's expression softened. "I'd still be able to spend time with her, but not as her full-time caregiver. You'd need to make other arrangements for her primary care." The logistics of finding a new nanny, adjusting Emma's routine, and managing the emotional impact of Clara's reduced presence felt overwhelming on top of everything else they were dealing with. But Ethan understood that these personal challenges were insignificant compared to the survival of his company and the livelihoods of everyone who depended on it. "When would this arrangement need to start?" he asked. "Monday. The government wants to begin the security assessment immediately, and every day of delay makes their approval process more complicated. Today was Thursday, which gave them less than a week to prepare for a fundamental restructuring of both their business operations and their personal lives." Ethan felt the familiar sensation of being swept along by events beyond his control. This time the current seemed to be carrying them towards stability rather than disaster. "There's one more thing," Clara added, her voice taking on a tone that suggested she'd been saving the most difficult news for last. "The government wants to interview key personnel as part of the security assessment. That includes you, Sarah Marcus, and anyone else with access to the compromised code." "What kind of interview?" Sarah asked. "Background investigation. They'll verify your identities, check your financial records, interview associates and family members. Standard procedure for anyone working with classified technology, but it can be invasive and time-consuming." Ethan nodded, understanding that they had little choice but to accept whatever requirements the government imposed. "Whatever they need. Our priority is getting through this crisis with the company intact." As the meeting concluded and the team began making plans for the security transition, Ethan found himself watching Clara with a mixture of gratitude and regret. Her technical expertise had saved Titan Motors from one crisis, and now her government connections were providing a path through another. But the cost of her help was becoming increasingly clear not just to the company's operations, but to the personal relationships that had made their small corporate family feel like something more than just another business. Emma had finished her homework and was sitting in the corner of the room, coloring in a book, while occasionally glancing up at the adults who were discussing changes that would affect her world in ways she couldn't fully understand. The sight of his daughter adapting to yet another disruption in her young life reminded Ethan of how much instability they'd both endured since her mother's death 2 years earlier. "Emma," he called softly, "come here for a minute." She approached with the careful attention that children give to conversations they sense might be important. Ethan knelt down to her eye level, trying to find words that would explain the situation without frightening her. "Clara is going to start helping Daddy's company with some very important work," he began. "That means she won't be able to take care of you every day like she has been." Emma's expression grew serious. "Because of the computer problems. Something like that. But we're going to find someone else who can help take care of you, and Clara will still visit us sometimes. Will the new person know how to make pancakes the way I like them?" The question was so innocently practical that Ethan almost smiled despite the gravity of the situation. "We'll make sure they learn all your favorite things." Emma nodded with the resilient acceptance that had carried her through previous changes in her life. "Okay, but Clara has to teach them about the bedtime stories too." "I'll make sure she does," Clara said, moving to join their conversation. "And I'll still be around to help with your science projects and soccer practice when I can." As they prepared to leave the office that evening, Ethan realized that they were at the end of one chapter of their lives and the beginning of another. The next few weeks would determine whether Titan Motors survived as an independent company, whether Clara's gamble on government cooperation would pay off, and whether they could all adapt to the new reality that success would require. The parking lot was nearly empty as they walked toward their cars, the setting sun casting long shadows across the asphalt. In a few days, this same parking lot would be filled with government security personnel conducting interviews and assessments that would determine their company's fate. The normalcy of the moment, a father, his daughter, and her caregiver walking to their cars after another day at the office felt precious and fragile against the backdrop of impending change. "Daddy," Emma asked as Ethan buckled her into her car seat, "is everything going to be okay?" It was the question he'd been asking himself for weeks through technical crises and legal complications and personal disruptions that had tested every assumption he'd made about building a stable life for his family. The honest answer was that he didn't know, that too many variables remained beyond his control, that too much depended on the decisions of people he'd never met in government offices he'd never seen. But looking at his daughter's trusting face, Ethan found himself believing that somehow, despite all the uncertainties and challenges ahead, they would find a way through. They had survived everything that had been thrown at them so far, and they had found unexpected allies in the most unlikely places. "Yes," he told Emma with more confidence than he felt. "Everything is going to be okay." As they drove home through the Silicon Valley evening, Ethan allowed himself to hope that the words would prove to be true. The following Monday arrived with the weight of inevitability, bringing with it a convoy of unmarked government vehicles that transformed Titan Motors' parking lot into something resembling a federal operation. Ethan watched from his office window as men and women in dark suits emerged from sedans carrying briefcases and equipment cases that suggested this would be far more than a routine inspection. Clara had arrived early that morning, but she looked different, more formal, more distant. Gone were the casual clothes and yellow cleaning gloves that had become her signature. Instead, she wore a crisp business suit and carried herself with the professional bearing of someone who had stepped back into a world she'd tried to leave behind. The transformation was so complete that Ethan almost didn't recognize the woman who had been making Emma breakfast just days earlier. The lead investigator is Agent Patricia Vance, Clara explained as they watched the government team set up equipment in the conference room. I worked with her during the final months of the Orion project. She's fair but thorough, and she doesn't tolerate any attempts to hide information. How much does she know about our situation? Sarah asked, joining them at the window. Everything relevant. I briefed her over the weekend about how the Orion code ended up in your navigation system and our proposed licensing arrangement. She's here to verify that Titan Motors is a legitimate company worth working with, not a front for foreign intelligence or corporate espionage. The words carried implications that Ethan hadn't fully considered. In the government's eyes, Titan Motors wasn't just a company that had inadvertently acquired stolen intellectual property. They were a potential security risk that needed to be thoroughly investigated before any cooperation could begin. What should we expect during these interviews? Ethan asked. Complete honesty, Clara replied without hesitation. They'll ask about your backgrounds, your financial situations, your business relationships, your personal associations. They'll cross-reference everything you tell them with independent sources. If they find any discrepancies, even minor ones, it could torpedo the entire licensing negotiation. The pressure was immense, but Ethan understood that they had no choice but to submit to whatever scrutiny the government deemed necessary. The alternative was the complete destruction of his company and the end of careers for everyone who worked there. Agent Vance entered the office at exactly 9 o'clock, accompanied by two colleagues who introduced themselves with titles that suggested expertise in technology assessment and security evaluation. Vance herself was a woman in her early 50s with graying hair and the kind of direct manner that came from years of dealing with classified information and the people who had access to it. Mr. Cross, she said, extending a firm handshake. Thank you for your cooperation with this assessment. I understand this situation is complicated for everyone involved. We appreciate your willingness to work with us, Ethan replied. Clara has explained that legitimate licensing might be possible if we meet your security requirements. That's correct. But I need to be clear about what this process entails. We're not just evaluating your company's technical capabilities or financial stability. We're determining whether Titan Motors and its leadership can be trusted with technology that has national security implications. The weight of responsibility settled on Ethan's shoulders once again. This wasn't just about saving his company anymore. It was about proving that he and his team deserved the government's trust in matters that could affect the country's security interests. The interviews began immediately with each member of the senior staff called individually to meet with Agent Vance and her colleagues. Ethan went first, spending nearly 3 hours answering questions that ranged from his educational background and career history to his personal finances and family relationships. Some questions seemed routine, while others probed into areas he'd never expected government investigators to care about. Tell me about your relationship with Ms. Hayes, Agent Vance said, about 2 hours into the interview. She's Emma's nanny. Was Emma's nanny? Ethan corrected himself. Now she's transitioning to a consulting role with our company. How did you hire her originally? Through a reputable childcare agency. She had excellent references and was wonderful with Emma from the start. Did you know about her background with the Orion project when you hired her? No, she never mentioned it, and I never asked about her previous career. Her job was taking care of my daughter, not consulting on autonomous vehicle technology. Agent Vance made notes on her tablet, her expression revealing nothing about whether she found his answers satisfactory. When did you first learn about her technical background? Ethan recounted the events of the past few weeks, the navigation system crisis, Clara's casual suggestion about memory allocation, the discovery of her expertise, and finally the revelation about the Orion Code. As he spoke, he realized how improbable the entire sequence of events must sound to someone hearing it for the first time. "You're telling me that your nanny solved a technical problem that stumped 15 professional engineers?" Agent Vance's tone suggested skepticism. "I know how it sounds, but you can verify it with my technical team. Clara identified the root cause of our navigation system failures within minutes of looking at the diagnostic data. And you had no idea she possessed this level of expertise. None whatsoever. She was hired to take care of Emma, and that's what she did. If she hadn't happened to be in the office that evening, when we were discussing the technical problems, we might never have learned about her background." The questioning continued for another hour, covering everything from Titan Motors' business relationships to Ethan's personal associations and financial obligations. By the time Agent Vance dismissed him, Ethan felt like he'd been thoroughly dissected and analyzed from every possible angle. Sarah's interview followed a similar pattern, though her questions focused more heavily on the company's technology licensing agreements and due diligence procedures. Marcus faced detailed technical questioning about the navigation system architecture and the integration of the Orion Code. Each interview lasted hours, and by late afternoon, the entire senior staff was exhausted from the intensive scrutiny. Clara's interview was the longest and most complex, lasting nearly 5 hours, as Agent Vance and her colleagues delved into her work on the Orion project, her departure from government service, and her current relationship with Titan Motors. When she finally emerged from the conference room, she looked drained but cautiously optimistic. "How did it go?" Ethan asked as the government team packed up their equipment for the day. "Better than I expected. They're satisfied that our situation is what we claim it is, an honest mistake rather than deliberate theft or espionage. But the security evaluation will take several more days, and they want to interview some of your employees who have access to the navigation system code." "What about the licensing negotiation?" "That depends on how the rest of the security assessment goes. If everything checks out, we should be able to begin formal discussions by the end of the week." As the government vehicles departed from the parking lot, Ethan felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had survived the first day of scrutiny, but the process was far from over. More importantly, the investigation had highlighted just how much their future depended on factors beyond their control, the decisions of government bureaucrats, the outcome of security evaluations, and the willingness of federal agencies to work with a private company. The rest of the week followed a similar pattern, with government investigators conducting interviews, reviewing technical documentation, and evaluating Titan Motors' security protocols. The atmosphere in the office became increasingly tense as employees tried to maintain normal operations while knowing that their every action was being observed and assessed. Emma struggled with the changes more than anyone. The new nanny Ethan had hired was competent and kind, but she wasn't Clara. Emma's bedtime routine became difficult. Her homework sessions required more patience, and she asked repeatedly when Clara would come back to take care of her full-time. "I miss the way Clara makes pancakes," Emma announced one morning as the new nanny Janet attempted to recreate Clara's weekend breakfast ritual. "I know, sweetheart," Ethan replied, watching Janet's well-meaning but unsuccessful efforts to match Clara's cooking style. "But Janet is learning, and Clara will still visit us sometimes." "It's not the same," Emma said, with the brutal honesty that only children can manage. She was right, of course. Nothing was the same anymore. The easy routine they'd established over the past 6 months had been shattered by circumstances none of them could have predicted. Clara's presence in their lives had become so natural that its absence felt like losing a family member. The situation became even more complicated when Clara stopped by the house that evening, to check on Emma and help with the transition. Watching Clara interact with his daughter, helping with homework, reading bedtime stories, maintaining the small rituals that made Emma feel secure, Ethan realized how much they had all come to depend on her presence. "She's adapting well," Clara said, after Emma had gone to sleep. "Janet seems very capable." "She is, but Emma's right, it's not the same." Clara nodded her expression, reflecting the same sadness that Ethan felt. "I know this is hard for all of you. It's hard for me too. But if the licensing negotiation works out, maybe we can find a way to maintain some of the connection we've built." "What would that look like?" "I don't know yet. The government restrictions on my time and activities are still being finalized. But I hope there will be room for continued involvement in Emma's life, even if it can't be the same as before." The conversation was interrupted by Ethan's phone ringing with a call from Agent Vance. At nearly 10 o'clock in the evening, a call from the lead investigator could only mean significant news. "Mr. Cross, I'm sorry to call so late, but I wanted to update you on our assessment progress." "Of course. What can you tell me?" "The preliminary security evaluation is complete, and I'm pleased to report that Titan Motors has passed all requirements for working with classified technology. Your company and your leadership team have been cleared for participation in the licensing negotiation." The relief that flooded through Ethan was overwhelming. Weeks of uncertainty, hours of intensive interviews, and constant worry about the company's future had led to this moment of validation. "That's wonderful news. What happens next?" "We'll begin formal licensing discussions on Monday. The process will involve representatives from the Defense Department, the Commerce Department, and the original Orion Project Oversight Committee. Ms. Hayes will serve as the technical liaison, helping to structure an agreement that serves everyone's interests." After ending the call, Ethan shared the news with Clara, who smiled with genuine relief for the first time in days. "This is the breakthrough we needed," she said. "Formal licensing negotiations mean the government is committed to finding a solution rather than just shutting down your operations." "How long will the negotiations take?" "Probably several weeks. Government procurement processes are never quick, and this involves multiple agencies with different priorities. But the fact that they're willing to negotiate at all is a very positive sign." The following Monday brought a new phase of the crisis, as government representatives arrived to begin the formal licensing discussions. Unlike the security investigators, these were policy experts and lawyers whose job was to structure an agreement that would satisfy legal, financial, and security requirements while allowing Titan Motors to continue using the Orion technology. The negotiations proved to be incredibly complex, involving not just the licensing fees and royalty payments, but also ongoing security requirements, restrictions on international sales, and oversight provisions that would give the government continuing influence over how the technology was used. "The financial terms are reasonable," Sarah reported after the first day of discussions. "The licensing fees are substantial but manageable, and the royalty structure is based on our actual sales rather than speculative projections." "What about the operational restrictions?" Ethan asked. "More complicated. We'll need to maintain enhanced security protocols indefinitely, submit to periodic audits, and obtain government approval for any international licensing agreements. It's workable, but it will add complexity and cost to everything we do." Clara had been working 18-hour days, shuttling between the government representatives and Titan Motors leadership to ensure that all parties understood the technical and legal implications of each proposed provision. Her expertise in both the Orion technology and government processes made her indispensable to the negotiations, but Ethan could see the strain wearing on her. "You need to pace yourself," he told her during a brief break between negotiating sessions. "This marathon approach isn't sustainable. I know, but we're close to a final agreement. Another few days and we should have something that works for everyone. And then what? What happens to your role with the company once the licensing deal is finalized? Clara paused, clearly having given the question considerable thought. The government wants me to continue as the security liaison, ensuring ongoing compliance with the licensing requirements. It would be a permanent position, splitting my time between Titan Motors and federal oversight duties. That sounds like it would work well for everyone. It would professionally, but it also means I'd never be able to return to taking care of Emma full-time. The security clearance requirements and conflict of interest regulations make that impossible. The personal cost of their professional success was becoming increasingly clear. Clara's expertise had saved Titan Motors twice, first by solving the navigation crisis, then by negotiating government cooperation instead of prosecution. But the price of that salvation was the end of the domestic stability that had made Emma's life feel secure and normal. "Have you talked to Emma about the permanent change?" Ethan asked. "Not directly. I've been trying to prepare her gradually, but she's still hoping this is all temporary." The conversation was interrupted by Agent Vance, who approached with a stack of legal documents and an expression that suggested significant developments. "We've reached a preliminary agreement," she announced. "The licensing terms have been approved by all relevant agencies, and we're ready to move to final documentation." The moment represented the culmination of weeks of uncertainty and negotiation, but Ethan found himself feeling more reflective than celebratory. Yes, Titan Motors would survive and continue operating with legitimate access to the Orion technology. But the cost of that survival had been measured in more than money. It had required fundamental changes to their corporate structure, their operational procedures, and their personal relationships. "When will the final agreements be ready for signature?" Sarah asked. "End of the week, assuming no last-minute complications. Once everything is signed, Titan Motors will have permanent licensing rights to the Orion technology, subject to the security and oversight provisions we've discussed." As the government representatives departed for another day of legal documentation, Ethan remained in the conference room with Clara, both of them contemplating how dramatically their lives had changed since that evening when she'd first looked at their navigation code. "Do you regret getting involved?" he asked her. "No," Clara replied without hesitation. "This technology deserves to be used for civilian applications. The Orion project was always intended to benefit society, not just military operations. Seeing it integrated into your autonomous vehicles feels like completing work that was left unfinished. Even at the cost of your relationship with Emma." Clara's expression grew sad. "That's the hardest part. I love taking care of her, and I'll miss being such a central part of her daily life. But maybe this is better in the long run. She needs stability, and my involvement with government work will always create uncertainty. She's going to miss you terribly. I'll miss her too. But children are resilient, and she has a wonderful father who will help her adjust to whatever changes come next." The compliment was appreciated, but Ethan wasn't feeling particularly wonderful as a father. Emma's life had been disrupted repeatedly over the past 2 years. First by her mother's death, then by the various nannies and caregivers who had tried to fill that void, and now by Clara's departure. Each change had been necessary, but that didn't make them any easier for a 6-year-old to understand or accept. That evening, Ethan made a decision that surprised even him. Instead of working late to review the licensing documentation, he left the office early and picked Emma up from school himself, something he hadn't done in months, due to the crisis management that had consumed his time. "Daddy!" Emma's face lit up with surprise and delight when she saw him waiting by the school entrance. "Why are you here?" "I thought maybe we could spend some time together, just us." They went for ice cream at Emma's favorite shop, then spent an hour at the playground, where she demonstrated her improved skills on the monkey bars and explained the complex social dynamics of first-grade friendships. For the first time in weeks, Ethan felt like he was fully present for his daughter, rather than distracted by corporate crises and government negotiations. "Daddy," Emma said, as they sat on a bench watching other children play, "is Clara going to come back and live with us?" The question was direct and deserved an honest answer, even if the truth was painful. "No, sweetheart. Clara has a new job that's very important, and it means she can't take care of you every day like she used to. But she still likes me, right? She loves you very much, and she'll still visit us sometimes. But things are going to be different from now on." Emma nodded with the serious consideration that she brought to all significant changes in her world. "Different like when Mommy went to heaven." The comparison caught Ethan off guard, reminding him that Emma's understanding of loss and change had been shaped by experiences that most children her age never faced. "Different, but not like that," he said carefully. "Clara isn't going away forever. She's just changing jobs like how you might change schools but still live in the same house." "Okay, but I hope she remembers to visit a lot." "I'm sure she will." As they drove home, Ethan realized that both he and Emma would need time to adjust to their new reality. The stability they'd found with Clara's presence had been more precious than he'd fully appreciated, and its loss would leave a gap in their daily lives that couldn't easily be filled. The final licensing agreements were signed on Friday afternoon, in a ceremony that was both momentous and oddly anticlimactic. Government officials, Titan Motors executives and legal representatives gathered in the conference room to execute documents that would govern their relationship for years to come. Clara signed as the designated security liaison, officially formalizing her dual role with the company and the federal government. This represents a new model for public-private cooperation in advanced technology development, Agent Vance said as the signing concluded. "We're hopeful that this arrangement will serve as a template for future collaborations." The words were encouraging, but Ethan's attention was focused on Clara, who looked both relieved and melancholy as she reviewed the documents that would define her professional future. She had achieved something remarkable, saving a company, preserving important technology, and creating a framework for government-industry cooperation that could benefit many other organizations. But the personal cost of that achievement was written clearly on her face. As the government representatives departed and the Titan Motors team began planning their return to normal operations, Ethan found himself thinking about the lessons learned from their crisis. Sometimes the most important solutions came from unexpected sources. Sometimes survival required accepting help from people whose expertise you'd never recognized. And sometimes a success came at costs that couldn't be measured in financial terms. "So what happens now?" Sarah asked as they watched the last government vehicle leave the parking lot. "Now we get back to building autonomous vehicles," Ethan replied. "But with better security protocols, regular government oversight, and the knowledge that we're using technology that's been legitimately licensed rather than accidentally stolen." "And Clara," Ethan looked toward Clara's new office where she was already setting up equipment for her dual role as corporate consultant and government liaison. "Clara becomes the bridge between two worlds that don't usually work together. It's probably the job she was meant to have all along." The transformation was complete, but Ethan understood that endings and beginnings were often the same event viewed from different perspectives. Titan Motors had survived its crisis and emerged stronger with legitimate access to revolutionary technology and a framework for continued innovation. Clara had returned to work that utilized her unique expertise while maintaining connection to the company and family that had given her a second chance. And Emma would learn to adapt to another change in her young life, supported by people who cared about her future. As Ethan prepared to leave the office and return to the domestic routines that would now be managed by someone else, he reflected on how much had changed since that evening, when a woman in yellow gloves had casually suggested checking memory allocation protocols. The suggestion had saved his company, but it had also transformed all their lives in ways that none of them could have predicted. The future remained uncertain, as it always did, but it felt more hopeful than it had in months. They had proven that problems could be solved, that unlikely partnerships could work, and that sometimes the best solutions came from the people you least expected to provide them. 6 months later, Ethan stood in the same conference room where his company had nearly died, but the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Sunlight streamed through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating wall-mounted displays, showing real-time data from over 300 Titan Motors vehicles operating flawlessly across 12 states. The red error messages that had once dominated these screens were now just a memory, replaced by the steady green indicators of successful autonomous navigation systems. The transformation had been remarkable, but it hadn't been easy. The months following the licensing agreement had brought new challenges as Titan Motors adapted to operating under government oversight while scaling their production to meet exploding demand. Clara's dual role as corporate consultant and federal liaison had proven invaluable, but it had also required everyone to adjust to new realities about security, transparency, and the delicate balance between innovation and regulation. The quarterly safety metrics are extraordinary, Dr. Sarah Kim announced to the assembled team, her voice carrying a confidence that had been absent during those dark weeks of crisis. 0 accidents involving our navigation system, 97% customer satisfaction ratings, and performance reliability that exceeds our original specifications by 18%. Marcus Chen, now promoted to Chief Engineering Officer, pulled up detailed technical displays that showed the evolution of their systems over the past 6 months. The Orion integration has been seamless. We've implemented 14 major improvements to the core algorithms, and each update has made the system more responsive and reliable. Ethan nodded, feeling a satisfaction that went beyond mere business success. They had built something genuinely revolutionary, not just an autonomous vehicle, but a new model for how innovative companies could work with government agencies to bring advanced technology to civilian markets. The partnership with federal oversight had initially felt restrictive, but it had ultimately provided resources and expertise that Titan Motors never could have accessed independently. "What about the international expansion?" asked Janet Rodriguez, whose role had expanded to include coordination with overseas regulatory agencies. "The European Union approved our navigation system last week," Sarah reported. "We'll begin sales in Germany and the Netherlands next quarter with full EU rollout planned for early next year. The Japanese market looks promising too, though their regulatory process is more complex." The international success was particularly meaningful because it validated not just Titan Motors' technology, but the entire framework of public-private cooperation that Clara had helped negotiate. Other companies were now seeking similar licensing arrangements for government-developed technologies, creating opportunities for innovation that had been locked away in classified research programs. Clara entered the conference room carrying her tablet and wearing the professional attire that had become her standard uniform since transitioning to her new role. The casual clothes and yellow gloves that had defined her early days with the Cross family were now part of a different chapter of her life, though the intelligence and quiet competence that had made her valuable as both a nanny and a systems architect remained unchanged. "Sorry I'm late," she said, taking her seat at the table. "I was finishing a call with the Pentagon about the new defense contract proposals." The defense contracts represented an unexpected development that had emerged from Titan Motors' success with civilian applications. Military procurement officials had become interested in reverse engineering the civilian navigation system for use in autonomous military vehicles, creating a situation where government technology had evolved through private sector innovation and was now returning to military applications with significant improvements. "How did that go?" Ethan asked. "Better than expected. They're proposing a 3-year development contract worth $47 million. The timeline is aggressive, but the technical requirements align well with our existing capabilities." The financial implications were staggering. 18 months earlier, Titan Motors had been on the verge of bankruptcy due to technical failures and legal complications. Now they were fielding offers for contracts that would secure the company's future for years to come, while positioning them as leaders in autonomous vehicle technology. "There's something else." Clara continued her expression, suggesting news that was significant but difficult to categorize. "The Pentagon wants to declassify portions of the original Orion project research and make it available for civilian licensing. They believe the public benefits outweigh the security concerns, especially given how successfully we've demonstrated civilian applications." The announcement created a moment of stunned silence as everyone processed the implications. Declassifying Orion project research would release advanced technologies that had been locked away for years, potentially revolutionizing multiple industries, while creating new opportunities for companies willing to navigate the complex licensing requirements. "What would that mean for us?" Marcus asked. "First, access to technologies that are years ahead of anything currently available in the civilian market," Clara replied. "Advanced sensor integration, predictive behavior, modeling autonomous swarm coordination, research that could transform not just transportation, but logistics manufacturing, even space exploration." Ethan felt the familiar excitement that came with glimpsing possibilities that extended far beyond his current vision. But he also understood that such opportunities would bring new responsibilities and challenges. Success in integrating advanced government technologies would require continued growth, additional security protocols, and probably more government oversight than they currently managed. "The downside?" he asked, knowing that Clara's government experience had taught her to consider all angles of such proposals. Increased scrutiny, more complex security requirements, and the risk of becoming too dependent on classified technologies that could be restricted or withdrawn if political priorities change. Plus, we'd be pioneering a new model of technology transfer that has no historical precedent. We'd be making up the rules as we go along. The risks were real, but so were the opportunities. Ethan looked around the table at his team of brilliant professionals who had proven their ability to handle extraordinary challenges and adapt to changing circumstances. If anyone could successfully navigate the complexities of expanded government partnership, it was this group. "How much time do we have to decide?" he asked. "They want a preliminary response within 30 days, but the formal proposal process would take months to complete. Plenty of time to evaluate the technical and business implications." As the meeting concluded and team members began returning to their various projects, Ethan found himself thinking about how dramatically their situation had changed. The company that had once struggled to solve basic navigation problems was now being invited to lead the development of revolutionary technologies that could reshape entire industries. But beyond the business implications, he was also thinking about the personal transformations that had accompanied their professional success. Clara had evolved from a hidden genius working as a nanny to a recognized expert bridging the gap between corporate innovation and government research. Emma had adapted to yet another change in her caregiving arrangements while maintaining her resilience and curiosity about the world around her. And Ethan himself had learned to balance his roles as CEO and single father while navigating challenges that would have seemed impossible just 2 years earlier. The afternoon brought an unexpected visitor when Emma arrived at the office with Janet, the nanny, who had replaced Clara in managing daily childcare responsibilities. Emma's arrival was no longer the routine occurrence it had been when Clara worked primarily as her caregiver, but she still visited the office occasionally, especially when Janet needed to run errands or attend appointments. "Daddy," Emma called out, as she burst into his office carrying a school project that required adult assistance. At 7 years old, she had grown more confident and independent, but she still brought the same infectious enthusiasm to everything she encountered. "What are you working on?" Ethan asked, clearing space on his desk for Emma to spread out her materials. "We have to build a model of something that helps people," Emma explained, pulling out construction paper, glue sticks, and markers. "I want to make one of your cars because they help people who can't drive by themselves." The innocent accuracy of her description touched Ethan in ways he hadn't expected. Emma understood in the direct way that children approach complex subjects that their work at Titan Motors was ultimately about helping people rather than just building impressive technology or generating profits. "That sounds like a perfect project," he said. "Do you want help cutting out the pieces?" As they worked together on Emma's school assignment, Ethan became aware that Clara had appeared in the doorway of his office. She watched them for a moment, with an expression that mixed fondness with something that might have been regret, a reminder that her relationship with Emma had necessarily changed as her professional responsibilities had expanded. "Hi, Clara." Emma looked up from her cutting project with obvious delight. "Look what I'm making." Clara entered the office and examined Emma's work with the serious attention she had always given to the girl's projects and concerns. "That's wonderful, Emma. Are you going to explain how the navigation system works?" "I'm going to tell them that the car has a really smart computer that can see everything around it and make good decisions about where to go. Just like how you helped Daddy's company when their computer wasn't working right." The casual reference to Clara's role in solving Titan Motors' crisis surprised both adults. Emma's understanding of those events had clearly evolved over the months, developing from confusion about why Clara couldn't take care of her anymore into pride in Clara's professional accomplishments. "You remember that?" Clara asked. "Of course, Janet told me that you're like a computer doctor who fixes really important problems. She said that's why you can't live with us anymore, but that you still care about us." Ethan felt grateful to Janet for helping Emma understand the situation in terms that made sense to a child, while emphasizing the continuity of Clara's affection despite the changes in their living arrangements. "Janet is right," Clara said, kneeling down to Emma's eye level. "I do still care about you very much, and I'm proud that you understand how important it is to help people with the work we do. Will you help me with my presentation next week? I want to make sure I explain everything correctly." Clara glanced at Ethan, who nodded encouragingly. "I'd love to help you with that." As Emma returned to her project, Clara and Ethan found themselves in the comfortable dynamic that had evolved over the months since her role transition. They were no longer employer and employee in the traditional sense, nor were they simply colleagues working toward shared goals. Instead, they had become something more complex, professional partners who shared responsibility for both innovative technology and the welfare of a child, who connected them in ways that transcended business relationships. "How is she adjusting to the new school year?" Clara asked, her voice carrying the genuine concern that had always characterized her interactions with Emma. "Better than I expected," Ethan replied. "Janet has been wonderful, and Emma seems to have found her footing with the new routine. She still asks about you regularly, but it's less anxious now, and more just wanting to share her experiences." "I'm glad. I was worried that the transition would be harder for her." "It was hard initially, but children are remarkably adaptable when they feel secure and loved. And she knows that your reduced presence isn't about her, it's about work that's important and interesting. Clara nodded, but Ethan could see that she still harbored some guilt about the disruption her career transition had caused in Emma's life. It was a reminder that even positive changes often came with emotional costs that couldn't be easily quantified or resolved. The conversation was interrupted by Sarah's arrival, with news that couldn't wait for the next scheduled meeting. "We just received a call from the European Space Agency," she announced, her voice carrying excitement mixed with disbelief. "They want to discuss adapting our navigation technology for autonomous lunar rovers." The announcement was so unexpected that all three adults stared at Sarah for a moment, before Emma looked up from her project to ask, "What's a lunar rover?" "It's a robot car that drives around on the moon," Ethan explained, though he was still processing the implications of Sarah's news. "Cool. Can I make one of those for my project too?" While Emma returned to her work with renewed enthusiasm for including space applications in her presentation, the adults considered what the European Space Agency's interest might mean for Titan Motors' future. "How did they even know about our technology?" Clara asked. "Apparently word is spreading through the international autonomous systems community," Sarah replied. "Our navigation algorithms have performed so well in terrestrial applications that space agencies are interested in adapting them for extraterrestrial environments." "The technical challenges would be enormous," Clara observed. "Moon-based navigation requires completely different sensor protocols, communication systems, and environmental adaptations." "But not impossible?" Ethan asked. "Not impossible. The core pathfinding and obstacle avoidance algorithms could probably be adapted with significant modifications. It would be like solving our original navigation problems, but with the added complexity of operating in an environment where everything we take for granted, gravity, atmosphere, GPS signals, either doesn't exist or works completely differently." The idea of Titan Motors technology operating on the moon was both thrilling and daunting. It represented the kind of recognition that Ethan had never dared to imagine when he'd started the company, but it also suggested challenges that would stretch their capabilities in entirely new directions. "What would be our next step?" he asked Sarah. "They want to send a technical team to evaluate our systems next month. If they're impressed, we could be looking at a development contract for the first civilian-designed autonomous lunar navigation system." As evening approached and the office began to empty, Ethan found himself reflecting on the trajectory that had brought them to this point. 2 years ago, he had been a struggling single father, trying to build a company while managing the complexities of raising a child without a partner. 18 months ago, his company had been on the verge of failure due to technical problems that seemed unsolvable. 6 months ago, they had been facing potential criminal charges for possessing stolen government property. Now they were fielding inquiries from space agencies while successfully operating autonomous vehicles in multiple countries and preparing to expand into defense contracting. The transformation was so complete that it felt almost surreal, except for the very real challenges and responsibilities that accompanied their success. "Daddy," Emma's voice interrupted his contemplation. "I finished my project. Do you want to see?" Emma's model was surprisingly sophisticated for a 7-year-old's work, featuring carefully cut paper components that represented the major elements of an autonomous vehicle. But what impressed Ethan most was the explanation she had written to accompany her presentation. "Autonomous cars help people by using computers to drive safely," he read aloud from her neat printing. "The computers can see everything around them and make good decisions about where to go. My daddy's company makes these cars with help from Clara, who is really smart about computers. These cars can help people who can't drive, and maybe someday they can help people on the moon too." The last sentence, clearly inspired by the afternoon's discussion about lunar rovers, made both Ethan and Clara smile. But the entire explanation demonstrated Emma's remarkable ability to understand complex concepts and distill them into terms that made sense to her peers. "This is excellent, Emma," Clara said, examining the model with genuine admiration. "You've explained everything very clearly, and I think your classmates will be impressed. Will you really help me practice my presentation?" "Absolutely. We can schedule some time this weekend if that works for your daddy and Janet." As they prepared to leave the office, Ethan realized that the evening represented something of a milestone. For the first time since Clara's role transition, they had spent several hours together working on business matters, helping Emma with her schoolwork, and simply enjoying each other's company without the interaction feeling forced or awkward. The relationship had evolved into something sustainable, allowing Clara to maintain meaningful connection with Emma while pursuing the professional work that utilized her expertise and passion. It wasn't the same as the intensive daily caregiving that had characterized their earlier arrangement, but it was perhaps more balanced and ultimately healthier for everyone involved. "Clara," Ethan said, as they gathered their belongings, "I want you to know how grateful we are, Emma and I both, for everything you've done. Not just the technical problems you've solved or the business opportunities you've created, but the way you've handled all the changes and transitions. It couldn't have been easy." Clara paused, considering her response. "It wasn't easy initially. Leaving government work had felt like giving up a part of myself, and returning to it meant giving up a different part. But I've learned that life doesn't always offer perfect solutions. Sometimes you have to create arrangements that honor all the things you care about, even if they're more complex than what you originally planned. And you're happy with how things have worked out." "I'm satisfied. I'm using skills and knowledge that matter. I'm contributing to work that benefits people, and I'm still able to be part of Emma's life in meaningful ways. It's different from what any of us expected, but it's good." As they walked toward the parking lot, Emma skipped ahead while chattering about her presentation plans and asking whether lunar rovers would need special tires for moon rocks. Watching his daughter's enthusiasm for sharing what she'd learned, Ethan felt a profound sense of gratitude for the unlikely sequence of events that had brought them to this point. The crisis that had nearly destroyed his company had also revealed resources and opportunities he never could have discovered otherwise. Clara's presence in their lives had begun as a simple employment arrangement, but had evolved into something much more significant, a partnership that had strengthened both his business and his family, while giving Clara a chance to return to work that utilized her remarkable talents. 3 weeks later, Titan Motors hosted a delegation from the European Space Agency in the same conference room where government investigators had once questioned the company's legitimacy. The contrast was remarkable. Instead of defending themselves against accusations of theft, they were now presenting their innovations to potential partners interested in adapting their technology for lunar exploration. The navigation algorithms demonstrate remarkable flexibility. Dr. Andreas Mueller, the ESA's lead autonomous systems specialist, observed as Marcus walked through the technical specifications. The obstacle avoidance protocols and pathfinding efficiency could indeed be adapted for lunar surface operations with appropriate modifications. Clara had prepared extensively for the presentation, working with Marcus and Sarah to identify which aspects of their navigation system would translate to lunar environments and which would require fundamental redesign. Her experience with the original Orion project proved invaluable in understanding how Earth-based autonomous systems could be modified for space applications. The primary challenges will be communication latency and environmental sensing. Clara explained, pulling up comparative data that illustrated the differences between terrestrial and lunar operating conditions. On Earth, our vehicles can communicate with central servers in real time and rely on GPS for positioning. On the Moon, they'll need to operate independently for extended periods while using only onboard sensors for navigation. How would you address those limitations? Dr. Mueller asked. Enhanced onboard processing power, predictive pathfinding algorithms that can plan routes several steps ahead, and redundant sensor arrays that can function without external reference points. Essentially, we'd be creating vehicles that are much more self-sufficient than anything currently operating on Earth. The technical discussion continued for hours, covering everything from power management in extreme temperature variations to dust mitigation strategies for sensitive electronic components. Emma sat quietly in the corner, working on homework while occasionally listening to discussions about technologies that seemed drawn from science fiction stories. By the end of the presentation, Dr. Mueller and his colleagues were clearly impressed with both Titan Motors' technical capabilities and their systematic approach to adapting existing technologies for new applications. We'd like to propose a preliminary development contract, Dr. Mueller announced. 6 months to create detailed specifications for lunar-adapted navigation systems, followed by prototype development and testing. If successful, this could lead to deployment on our next generation of lunar exploration missions. The offer represented another milestone in Titan Motors' unlikely journey from near bankruptcy to international recognition. More importantly, it validated the approach they had developed for combining private sector innovation with government partnership to create technologies that served public interests while generating sustainable business returns. As the ESA delegation departed with promises to finalize contract details within the month, Ethan found himself thinking about the magazine article that had arrived on his desk that morning. The piece published in a leading technology journal was titled, "The Nanny Who Revolutionized Autonomous Vehicles: How Hidden Talent Changed Everything." The article told their story with remarkable accuracy, describing Clara's transition from classified government research to childcare to corporate consulting, while highlighting the broader implications of their public-private partnership model. But what struck Ethan most was the article's conclusion, which suggested that their experience demonstrated the importance of recognizing talent wherever it appears and creating opportunities for people to contribute their skills in ways that serve both individual fulfillment and broader social benefits. "Did you see the magazine article?" Sarah asked, as they reviewed the financial projections that would need to be updated to include potential lunar development contracts. "I did. What did you think?" "Accurate mostly, though it makes our success sound more inevitable than it felt while we were living through it." "That's the nature of success stories," Clara observed, joining their conversation. "They always read more smoothly in retrospect than they feel while you're struggling with uncertainty and difficult decisions." "Any regrets about how your story turned out?" Ethan asked her. Clara considered the question while watching Emma pack up her homework materials. "No regrets. Surprises, certainly. I never expected to go from government research to childcare to corporate consulting to space technology development. But each transition taught me something important about what I value and what kinds of work give my life meaning." "What did you learn?" "That expertise isn't just about what you know. It's about how you apply what you know to help solve problems that matter. Whether that's debugging navigation algorithms or helping a child with homework, or negotiating with government bureaucrats, the underlying skill is recognizing patterns and finding solutions that work for everyone involved." Emma approached with her backpack properly organized and her project materials carefully stored for transport home. "Are we ready to go?" "Ready," Ethan confirmed, gathering his own materials while Clara shut down the presentation equipment they'd used for the ESA meeting. As they prepared to leave the office, Ethan noticed that Emma had drawn something on the back of one of her homework papers, a simple sketch that showed 3 figures standing next to what was clearly meant to be a car. Above the drawing, she had written "My Family" in careful block letters. The drawing was touching in its innocence, but what struck Ethan most was Emma's instinctive understanding that family could be defined by care and commitment rather than just biological relationships or legal arrangements. Clara's presence in their lives had evolved from employee to consultant to something that transcended professional categories, a person who had become integral to their family's story while maintaining her own independent path and contributions. 6 months later, as Titan Motors prepared to ship their first lunar navigation prototypes to the European Space Agency's testing facility, Ethan received a phone call that brought their story full circle in an unexpected way. "Mr. Cross, this is Dr. Jennifer Walsh from the MIT Technology Review. We're preparing a feature article about successful public-private partnerships in advanced technology development, and we'd like to profile Titan Motors as a case study." The interview request was flattering, but not particularly surprising. Their company had received increasing media attention as their success in combining government partnership with commercial innovation became more widely recognized. "What angle are you planning to take?" Ethan asked. "We're interested in how companies can successfully integrate classified technologies into civilian applications while maintaining both security requirements and commercial viability. But we're also curious about the human elements of your story, particularly how you identified and utilized expertise that wasn't immediately obvious." "You mean Clara's background?" "Exactly. Her transition from the Orion project to childcare to corporate consulting represents a fascinating example of how talent can be hidden in unexpected places. We think there are broader lessons about recognizing and developing human potential that go beyond just technology transfer." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering the technical business and personal aspects of their journey. As Ethan described the sequence of events that had transformed a crisis into an opportunity he found himself appreciating, once again how much their success had depended on being open to help from unexpected sources and willing to adapt their assumptions about what kinds of partnerships might prove valuable. After ending the call, Ethan walked to the engineering bay where Clara was working with Marcus on final calibrations for the lunar prototypes. The equipment surrounding them was far more sophisticated than the diagnostic tools they'd used during those early crisis meetings. But Clara's approach remained the same: methodical, insightful, and focused on finding solutions that addressed the real underlying problems rather than just surface symptoms. "How are the lunar simulations going?" he asked. "Better than expected," Marcus replied, gesturing toward displays that showed virtual representations of rover movements across simulated lunar terrain. "The modified pathfinding algorithms are performing well in low-gravity scenarios, and the dust mitigation protocols are exceeding our design specifications." "When will the prototypes be ready for shipping?" "Next week," Clara said, reviewing a checklist of final testing requirements. "ESA wants them delivered to their Netherlands facility by the end of the month for integration with their rover platforms." The timeline was aggressive but manageable, representing the culmination of months of intensive development work that had stretched Titan Motors' capabilities in entirely new directions. Success with the lunar navigation systems would establish them as leaders in space-based autonomous technologies, while opening opportunities for future contracts with NASA private space companies and international space agencies. "Any word on the next development phase?" Ethan asked. "ESA is already talking about Mars applications," Clara replied with a smile that suggested she found the prospect both exciting and slightly surreal. "Apparently, our navigation algorithms are so adaptable that they think we could modify them for use on multiple planetary surfaces." The idea of Titan Motors technology operating on Mars was almost too ambitious to contemplate seriously, but Ethan had learned not to dismiss possibilities that seemed impossible at first glance. 2 years earlier, the idea of his Nanny solving complex navigation problems had seemed equally improbable. As the workday concluded and the office began to empty, Ethan found himself in the conference room, where their story had begun, reviewing financial reports that documented their transformation from struggling startup to internationally recognized leader in autonomous systems technology. The numbers were impressive revenue growth that exceeded their most optimistic projections, profit margins that reflected both operational efficiency and premium pricing for advanced technology, and cash reserves that provided security for future development while funding continued innovation. But beyond the financial success, he was most proud of what they had created as an organization. Titan Motors had become a place where diverse talents were recognized and utilized, where individual expertise served collective goals, and where commercial success supported broader social benefits. They had proven that companies could successfully bridge the gap between government research and civilian applications while creating opportunities for personal growth and professional fulfillment. Clara entered the conference room carrying her tablet and a small wrapped package that suggested personal rather than professional business. "What's the occasion?" Ethan asked, noticing the gift. "Emma's birthday is next week, but I wanted to give this to her early so she could use it for her presentation about space exploration." Clara set the package on the table and unwrapped it to reveal a sophisticated model of a lunar rover complete with detailed features that reflected her understanding of both current space technology and the navigation systems they were developing for future missions. "She's going to love this," Ethan said, examining the model's impressive level of detail. "Did you make it yourself?" "With some help from the prototyping lab. I thought it might help her explain how autonomous vehicles could work in space as well as on Earth." The gift reflected Clara's continued attention to Emma's education and interests, but it also demonstrated how naturally she had integrated her professional expertise with her personal relationships. The lunar rover model wasn't just a toy, it was a teaching tool that would help Emma understand concepts that connected her father's work with her own curiosity about science and exploration. "She'll want to take it to school for show and tell," Ethan predicted. "I was hoping she would. I included some technical specifications that she can use to explain how the navigation systems work, though I simplified them for a second-grade presentation." As Clara rewrapped the gift, Ethan reflected on how their relationship had evolved into something that benefited everyone involved while honoring the different priorities and responsibilities that shaped their individual lives. Clara had found a way to remain meaningfully connected to Emma's development while pursuing work that utilized her expertise and passion. Emma had learned to appreciate Clara's professional accomplishments while maintaining the emotional connection that had made Clara such an important figure in her life. And Ethan had discovered that successful partnerships could take many forms, adapting to changing circumstances while preserving the essential elements that made them valuable. "Clara," he said, as she prepared to leave, "I want you to know that what we've built here, not just the company, but the way we've managed to balance professional and personal relationships, it's something special. I don't think many people could have navigated all the changes and challenges as gracefully as you have." Clara paused, clearly moved by the acknowledgement. "It hasn't always been graceful. There were moments when I wasn't sure any of this would work, when the role transitions felt too complicated, when the government partnership seemed impossible, when Emma's needs seemed incompatible with professional demands. But you found a way to make it work. We found a way to make it work. This isn't something I could have managed alone, and it's not something that would have been possible without understanding and flexibility from everyone involved. What's next for you? Any thoughts about what comes after lunar rovers and potential Mars missions?" Clara smiled, but her expression carried the same mixture of excitement and uncertainty that had characterized her approach to each major transition in their shared story. "I've learned not to plan too far ahead. 6 months ago, I was focused on terrestrial navigation systems and government compliance requirements. Now I'm helping design technology for space exploration while maintaining partnerships that span multiple industries and agencies. Whatever comes next will probably be something I haven't imagined yet. But you're ready for it. I'm ready to adapt to it, whatever it turns out to be. And I'm confident that we've created something here that can handle challenges and opportunities that none of us can predict right now. As Clara left for the evening, and Ethan prepared to pick up Emma from her after-school program, he found himself thinking about the magazine article that would be published next month, documenting their story as an example of successful innovation and partnership. The article would focus on business strategies and technology transfer, but Ethan understood that the real lesson was simpler and more profound than any case study could capture. Sometimes the most important solutions came from recognizing talent in unexpected places and being willing to adapt established assumptions about how things should work. Sometimes success required accepting help from people whose capabilities you'd never fully appreciated. And sometimes the best outcomes emerged from creating partnerships that honored individual expertise while serving collective goals. The woman in yellow gloves, who had solved their impossible problem in 30 seconds, had taught them that genius wasn't always found in titles or credentials, but in people who combined technical knowledge with genuine care for the problems they were trying to solve. That lesson had transformed not just their company, but their understanding of how human potential could be recognized, developed and directed toward purposes that created value for everyone involved. As Ethan drove through Silicon Valley toward Emma's school, he reflected on how much their lives had changed since that evening when Clara had first looked at their navigation code. They had built more than just a successful company. They had created a model for how professional excellence and personal relationships could coexist and strengthen each other. The future remained full of unknowns, from Mars missions to new technologies to the countless personal and professional challenges that lay ahead. But Ethan felt confident that whatever came next, they had proven their ability to find solutions that worked for everyone involved. They had learned to recognize talent wherever it appeared to adapt to changing circumstances while preserving essential values, and to create partnerships that served both individual fulfillment and broader social benefits. The story that had begun with crisis and near failure had become something much more hopeful, a demonstration that the right combination of expertise, dedication, and mutual respect could overcome seemingly impossible challenges while creating opportunities that none of them could have imagined at the beginning. It was a lesson worth sharing, but more importantly, it was a foundation for whatever extraordinary challenges and possibilities awaited them in the years to come.